A millionaire showed up at his cleaner's house unannounced and never imagined what he would find. Richard Hale had everything most people dreamed of achieving: skyscrapers bearing his name, a fortune that grew year after year, and the flawless image of a ruthless CEO in New York. But behind the expensive suits and the life of luxury was a lonely man, incapable of trusting those around him. To Richard, employees were nothing more than parts of a vast money-making machine, and none of them deserved more than a distant glance. Until one day, driven by suspicion, he decided to go to the home of Grace Miller, the company's cleaner, a reserved woman who never spoke about her personal life. What Richard found in that modest house not only changed the way he saw his employee, but also shook everything he believed about wealth, success, and happiness. Leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Richard Hale woke up every day at 5:30 in the morning. No alarm needed. His body was already conditioned to that near-military discipline, the result of decades spent running one of the largest construction companies in New York. At 48, he owned skyscrapers that had reshaped the city's skyline and developments scattered across the country. From the top floor of his glass-walled penthouse on Park Avenue, he would look out over the city as it came to life and remember the promise he had made to himself as a young man. Never again would he feel the weight of poverty. Breakfast was always meticulously prepared: whole grain toast, black coffee without sugar. Everything was timed, every detail in its place. There was no laughter, no conversations, no sound of children running through the halls, only the cold silence filling a space far too large for one man alone. Richard had grown used to it, though at times that emptiness seemed louder than the traffic roaring outside. He was the kind of man who commanded respect simply by walking into a room. The flawless cut of his suit, his upright posture, his calculating gaze, nothing about him ever seemed uncertain. In boardroom meetings, his word was final. At gala events, his presence was reported in the business pages. Some called him the King of Concrete, others the Real Estate Shark, titles he carried with indifference, as if they didn't truly apply to him. For Richard, everything boiled down to numbers: square footage, contracts, percentages. The people around him were just parts of the machine that kept his fortune growing. His private life, however, remained untouched. There had never been space for family, close friends, or lasting relationships. He believed everyone had a hidden agenda, a price, some way of trying to take advantage. That belief built invisible walls around him, keeping intimacy at bay. Inside the company, his name inspired as much fear as admiration. Mid-level employees avoided direct eye contact. Secretaries knew that even a minute of delay could cost them their jobs, and executives quickly learned not to challenge his decisions. He was seen as ruthless, but efficient, and the glass empire he had built was proof of that. Yet in the hallways, there were rumors about his coldness, stories of employees dismissed without a second chance. Richard didn't care. In his eyes, the corporate world was a chessboard, and weakness had no place there. Still, something occasionally unsettled him, a faint spark that flickered when he happened to pass, almost unnoticed, by a woman in a blue uniform pushing a cleaning cart. Her name was Grace Miller. To most, she was just the cleaner who showed up every day at Hale Constructions, wiped down the corridors, and disappeared at the end of her shift. For Richard, for years, she had been invisible too, just another cog in the machine that kept things running smoothly. But little by little, he began to notice something: the way Grace did her job without ever complaining, the care in her details, the speed with which she vanished the moment her shift was over, while other employees tried to cozy up to managers. For favors, she never asked for anything. Not a raise, not a favor, not even a misplaced word. Always polite, always restrained, always distant. And somehow, that quiet reserve began to stir Richard's curiosity. That particular morning, as he crossed the main lobby toward the car waiting to take him to a meeting, Richard saw her again. Grace was quietly wiping down a table near reception. Her hair tied back simply, her face tired but focused. When she noticed him approaching, she lowered her eyes, just as she always did, and kept working. For a moment, Richard slowed his steps, as if trying to see beyond the obvious. He found nothing more than the same reserved woman as always, yet her image lingered in his mind longer than he cared to admit. Sitting in the back seat of the car, surrounded by papers and reports, his thoughts drifted back to that almost invisible figure. What was it about her that made him think beyond the glass walls and metallic shine of the buildings he constructed? Richard didn't have an answer, and that unsettled him. He was used to mastering numbers, projects, deadlines, all with surgical precision. Uncertainty had no place in his life. Yet Grace represented exactly that, an unknown. He wondered why. She never accepted a ride when it rained, why she always seemed in such a rush to leave, why she never spoke of her own life. For a man accustomed to spotting hidden intentions in every gesture, that silence was more disturbing than words. He didn't know it yet, but his curiosity about that woman would become the first step toward the greatest transformation of his life. Grace Miller arrived every day just before 6 in the morning at the Hale Constructions building. Her navy blue uniform, already worn from daily use, stood in stark contrast to the flawless suits that would later fill the glass corridors. She walked with steady steps, pushing a cart loaded with rags, buckets, and cleaning products, as if it were an extension of her body. She was often the first to arrive and the last to leave, yet she never complained. Her colleagues in maintenance would say Grace was reliable, always willing to help if asked, but she kept a natural distance that prevented her from forming bonds. She worked quietly and meticulously, leaving every floor spotless before the executives began their day. To those rushing past her, she was just another faceless employee, someone who cleaned up after others, a person without history or identity. Richard noticed her in passing, almost always without her realizing it. Unlike other employees who tried to catch his eye with compliments, comments, or attempts at conversation, Grace never strayed from her routine. She didn't ask for favors, never mentioned personal problems, and never tried to stand out. And it was precisely that absence of effort that made her different. Richard observed the way she hurried at the end of her shift, quickly gathering her things and slipping out the side door before the clock had even struck the hour. There were no long goodbyes, no casual hallway chats, only a quiet urgency, as though something beyond those glass walls was waiting for her. At first, it seemed trivial, but over time it grew into something that unsettled him. During a board meeting where numbers and projections were being debated, Richard found himself distracted. Through the wide conference room window, he caught a glimpse of that blue uniform moving swiftly down the corridor, almost mechanical. He tried to ignore it and refocus on the charts displayed on the screen, but his mind kept circling back to the same question. Who was this woman beyond the uniform? It wasn't in his nature to think about lower-level employees. To him, they were simply pieces of the machinery that kept everything running. Yet, with Grace, there was an odd persistence in noticing her. It was as if her silence spoke louder than any attempt to demand attention. And Richard wasn't used to dealing with things he couldn't categorize. Other executives, in their casual hallway chatter, referred to Grace only as the cleaner who never misses a day. Some, in a tone of mean-spirited humor, would remark that no one knew anything about her life, that maybe she had secrets or hidden motives. When Richard overheard such talk, he reacted only with a cold glance, never joining in. Yet privately, their words echoed. His habit of distrusting everyone made those insinuations stick in his mind. It wasn't like him to let something so small take up space in his thoughts, but this time he couldn't brush it off. Each time he crossed paths with Grace in the corridors, his curiosity grew heavier. That same week, Richard returned earlier than usual from a site visit and entered the main building just as Grace's shift was ending. From a distance, he watched as she quickly changed out of her uniform and into simple clothes, a pair of jeans and a worn-out jacket. He also noticed the haste with which she left, clutching her bag to her chest as though every second mattered. His driver mentioned casually that he had often seen her taking crowded buses home, even when it rained. Richard said nothing, only watching through the tinted window of his luxury car as her figure disappeared into the stream of people on the street. The contrast between his own routine, filled with limousines and fine dining, and hers, marked by urgency and simplicity, began to unsettle him more than he wanted to admit. That night, lying in his bed that felt too large, Richard reflected on the strangeness of this new feeling. There was no logical reason to spend so much thought on a single employee. He had always prided himself on keeping his personal life entirely separate from business, and never once had he cared about the private lives of those who cleaned his offices. Yet Grace's image, her tired but calm face, kept returning to him. She was like a loose piece in the carefully ordered puzzle of his life. He tried to ignore it, burying himself in reports and contracts, but when the lights went out, she returned to his thoughts. There was no admiration, no clear suspicion, only a growing curiosity he couldn't explain. And that quiet unease was beginning to weave itself into his routine. Richard Hale spent the entire week haunted by a restlessness he couldn't shake. The image of Grace Miller hurrying out of the office at the end of her shift, clutching her bag tightly to her chest as if protecting hidden secrets, replayed in his mind more often than any business chart or financial report. For a man like him, that was unacceptable. He was used to having absolute control over every detail of his life. Construction deadlines, multi-million-dollar contracts, international meetings. Yet now he was consumed by a question he couldn't answer. Confronting her directly was out of the question. Richard considered asking personal questions a sign of weakness. So he chose to handle it the way he handled business, by investigating on his own, without intermediaries, reports, or second-hand interpretations. That Friday, he quietly adjusted his schedule. He cut his workday short, signed off on documents with curt phrases, and avoided any social commitments that might delay his plan. By early evening, he left the Hale Constructions building with only his driver in tow. He crossed the marble lobby in silence, ignoring the routine greetings, and slid into the back seat of the car without a word. The driver, accustomed to his rigid habits and precise orders, was caught off guard when no destination was given. Richard then pulled a small folded note from his pocket, an address he had discreetly obtained from the company's internal records, and handed it forward. His only words were, "Take me here." The clipped tone left no room for questions. The car moved through Manhattan's glowing avenues, the city lights reflecting off glass towers and luxury storefronts. Richard watched the skyline he himself had helped shape. Yet tonight it felt oddly distant, as if he were stepping away from his own empire. Gradually, the scenery shifted. Elegant restaurants gave way to modest diners, sleek cars to crowded buses, and polished high-rises to aging brick buildings worn down by time. Richard kept his gaze fixed on the window, absorbing every detail with the same scrutiny he applied when scouting new land for development. But this wasn't business. There were no figures to calculate, no contracts to sign, only a growing awareness of how far removed this place was from the world he inhabited. The further they drove, the narrower and dimmer the streets became. Small corner stores lit up the blocks. Children played on cracked sidewalks, and peeling walls told stories of years of hardship. Richard sat in silence, but the driver, unsettled by the unfamiliar route, finally asked, "Are you sure about this, sir?" His voice carried a mix of hesitation and concern. Richard answered with nothing more than a hard stare in the rearview mirror, sharp enough to silence any further questions. The car's interior felt quiet again, a stark contrast to the sounds outside: voices, laughter, car horns, the rhythm of a neighborhood that lived without hurry. When they turned the final corner, Richard caught sight of Grace's house. The faded blue paint bore the marks of time, but there was a clear effort to keep it presentable. Potted plants sat in reused cans by the doorway, and thin curtains covered the small windows. The sleek black car pulling up to the curb immediately drew attention. Children stopped playing to watch, and neighbors whispered among themselves, their eyes following the unusual scene. Richard stepped out with his usual composure, his suit flawless, his stride confident, carrying with him the aura of authority he wore so naturally in boardrooms. But his eyes stayed locked on the small iron gate ahead, the barrier to the truth he had come to uncover. He walked up to it, raised his hand, and knocked 3 times. Each strike seemed louder than it should have been, echoing into the night. For a moment, there was silence, only the faint sound of a television coming from a nearby home. Then he heard hurried footsteps inside. The door opened slowly, revealing Grace. She was out of uniform now, wearing simple clothes, her hair tied back loosely. When she recognized him standing there, her eyes widened in shock. "Mr. Hale?" she whispered, her voice heavy with surprise. The silence that followed hung between them, thick as the night itself. Richard held her gaze, steady and unflinching, offering no explanation. He was standing at the threshold of a world he had never known, about to witness something he never could have imagined. Just behind Grace, 3 children appeared almost at once, as if drawn by the unexpected presence at the door. Ethan, the eldest at 13, carried on his shoulders a seriousness far beyond his years. He watched Richard with wary eyes, standing slightly in front of his siblings as if to shield them. Lily, 10 years old, stepped forward timidly, clutching a worn notebook in her hands, her wide eyes filled with curiosity and a touch of admiration. Then came Sam, only 7, grinning brightly, holding a broken plastic toy car, still marked from. Again interrupted. Grace tried to hide her embarrassment, raising her arm quickly to hold them back, but the gesture betrayed her discomfort. Richard stood there in silence, absorbing the scene that in a matter of seconds shattered the invisibility he had always assigned to this woman. There was no calculated mystery here, only life presenting itself plainly before him. Realizing she couldn't avoid the inevitable, Grace opened the door a little wider and stepped aside. Richard entered with measured steps, scanning the space as though inspecting unfamiliar ground. The living room was small, furnished with modest pieces, but meticulously kept. A worn sofa was covered with a floral blanket, and on the scratched wooden table rested a vase filled with simple flowers, brightening the atmosphere. Framed photographs lined the walls, capturing birthdays, outings, smiles, the ordinary snapshots of a family's life. Nothing resembled the lavish halls Richard was used to, yet everything bore the mark of genuine care he struggled to define. The air carried the aroma of a freshly cooked meal mixed with the faint scent of laundry soap, and somehow it felt warmer, more welcoming than the imported fragrances that filled his penthouse dot. As Richard's eyes wandered through the room, they caught sight of a half-open door where the sound of fragile breathing came from. Margaret, Grace's mother, lay on a narrow iron bed propped up by thin pillows. Her face bore the marks of time, but her eyes still carried a soft light as she noticed her daughter enter. Richard hesitated at the threshold, but when Margaret spotted him, she managed a smile that clashed with the frailty of her body. "Who is it, dear?" she asked in a weakened voice. "It's Mr. Hale, Mother, my boss," Grace replied, adjusting the sheets. The elderly woman stretched out her hand with effort, and Richard, unable to refuse, took it. The touch was simple, but within it lay a silent gratitude that caught him off guard. There was no trace of self-interest in her voice when she whispered, "Thank you for giving my daughter work. She does everything for us." Richard froze for a few seconds, as though her words reverberated in a part of him he had long ignored. That kind of sincere gratitude felt heavier than all the polished compliments he received at business dinners, where every word came with expectation. He returned to the living room quietly, only to be intercepted by Sam tugging at his trouser leg, lifting the battered toy car for him to see. "Want to see my toy?" the boy asked with the innocence of someone unaware of social barriers. Richard crouched slightly, examining the car patched with tape and bottle caps, and found himself at a loss for words. Lily, encouraged by her brother, opened her notebook and revealed colorful sketches of houses, trees, and people holding hands. "I like drawing," she said softly, though her voice carried an unmistakable enthusiasm. Ethan kept his distance, cautious and reserved, but his watchful gaze never left Richard. Grace, torn between pride and unease, stood by silently, unsure of how to react. She had never imagined her boss inside her home, sitting on the worn sofa, where she collapsed after long shifts, listening to her children's stories and dreams. She brought him a glass of water in a scratched tumbler, and Richard accepted it without a word. The humble gesture struck him as more meaningful than any crystal goblet he had ever raised at high-end receptions. He sat there quietly, water in hand, listening to the children chatter, taking in every detail of the house, noticing the quiet dignity that lingered in every effort to keep things in order. The contrast with his own life was glaring, yet for the first time in years, he didn't feel in control. When he finally rose to leave, more time had passed than he ever expected to stay. The children instinctively drew closer, as though already anticipating his return, while Margaret still watched from her room with that same gentle smile. Grace opened the door with an expression Richard couldn't quite decipher. Was it embarrassment, relief, or simply exhaustion? He stepped outside again, the car waiting patiently on the narrow street, his driver's eyes alert. Sliding into the back seat, Richard cast one last glance through the rearview mirror. The small blue house glowed softly from within, more alive than any glass tower he had ever built. For the first time in many years, he had no words to explain what he had just witnessed. Back in his luxurious Park Avenue apartment, Richard Hale sat on the imported leather sofa with the sudden realization that the wide, immaculate space had never felt so empty. The penthouse, perched high above the city, offered a breathtaking view of the skyline lights reflecting off glass towers, cars below reduced to tiny specks in the night. Everything was in its place as always. Expensive furniture, flawless rugs, crystal glasses neatly lined on the bar. Yet after stepping into Grace's home, it all seemed staged, as if it were nothing more than a polished backdrop, stripped of substance. The silence that once served him well, a companion that guaranteed focus and distance, now pressed down on him with an oppressive weight, almost deafening. The memory of the makeshift vase of flowers, the family photographs hanging on the wall, and even Sam's broken toy car returned again and again. He stood, uncorked a bottle of fine wine, poured himself a glass, but the drink that had always tasted of accomplishment now slid down bitter. Powerless to quiet the images that haunted his mind in the days that followed, Richard tried to resume his usual rhythm with his trademark discipline. Morning board meetings, video calls with international investors, inspections at construction sites. Everything progressed as expected. Contracts signed, numbers hitting targets, projects advancing. Still, something had shifted in the way he moved through his world. Walking down the halls of his own company, he found the faces of employees were no longer as interchangeable as they once seemed. He noticed the security guard at the entrance, the exhaustion etched in the secretary's eyes as she arrived before dawn, the nervous rush of the intern balancing stacks of folders. Each detail whispered to him that these were not just functions in a system, but individuals with lives extending far beyond the glass walls. For the first time, Richard found it impossible to see them solely as positions on a chart. He began to see them as people at first. The change revealed itself in small gestures, barely noticeable. One morning, as he entered the building, he greeted the doorman by name, startling the man who had never expected the CEO even to know he existed. On another occasion, Richard stopped near a cleaner picking up papers from the floor and asked how she was doing. Confused, the woman answered awkwardly, unsure if it was formality or a genuine question. Richard recognized her discomfort and fell silent, reflecting on how long he had ignored those around him. It wasn't natural for him to make small talk or show interest, but after what he had witnessed in Grace's home, continuing to keep distance seemed absurd. Her ability to shoulder so many burdens without complaint made it impossible for him to view his employees as mere statistics anymore. Initial reaction in the company was shock. Some employees whispered that Richard had changed, that perhaps he was testing them, or worse, that it was a public relations tactic to soften his image. The executives, accustomed to his cold demeanor, exchanged suspicious glances the first. Few times they saw him exchange kind words with entry-level staff, but there were no grand speeches, no official memos. Only direct, simple, almost personal gestures, accumulating day after day. Within a week, it became impossible to ignore. The CEO, who once stormed past with eyes glued to his phone, now paused to hear an answer, even a brief one, before moving on. Late one afternoon, Richard stepped into a service elevator by chance and found himself among a group of employees chatting about their lives outside of work. One spoke about his son learning to ride a bike. Another mentioned a sick mother and the difficulty of securing medical care. Richard said nothing, just listened, but every sentence carried him back to Grace's modest home. He left the elevator in silence, yet the conversation echoed in his mind as he walked to his office. For years, he had chosen to ignore stories like these, convinced they were irrelevant to his role. But now, he could no longer pretend they didn't matter. The perspective he had carried since his own impoverished childhood crept back in, reminding him of how far he had drifted from something essential. That night, returning home, Richard lay in his oversized bed staring at the ceiling for long minutes, sleep refusing to come. The silence around him, once comfortable, now gnawed at him as a reminder of the emptiness that filled his days. He thought again of Margaret's fragile smile, of Lily's soft voice as she showed him her drawings, of Sam's innocent request for help with his toy. And he thought of Grace, holding everything together with dignity, never asking for anything in return. These images collided violently with the life he had built: cold walls, crystal glasses, piles of reports. For the first time in many years, Richard felt something was deeply wrong with the way he lived, as if he had built an empire solid on the outside, but hollow at its core. In the days that followed, Richard Hale realized that something inside him could no longer return to what it had been before. Work remained demanding, mornings still filled with meetings, and stacks of contracts still awaited his signature. Yet, a constant restlessness lingered in his mind, a silent pull drawing him back to the modest neighborhood where Grace lived. He tried convincing himself it was only curiosity, that he simply needed to understand more about the quiet employee who had worked in his company for years without ever asking for anything. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The memory of the children's eyes, the frailty of the elderly mother, the contrast between the dignity of that humble home and the emptiness of his own life. On Friday, after enduring a business dinner that felt more unbearable than usual, he slipped into the car and told his driver to take him once again to that distant address, offering no explanation. When they arrived, the car parked discreetly on the narrow street. Richard lingered for a few moments, watching the pale blue house lit from within. The sound of children's voices spilled through the window cracks, and he felt a strange anxiety, something he hadn't experienced since youth. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the gate with slower steps than on his first visit, as though the weight of his decision carried more significance this time. Before he could knock, the door opened and Ethan appeared, holding an old bicycle with rusted chains and a loose tire. Sweaty from his effort, the boy looked up and, upon recognizing the visitor, did not show the same sharp suspicion as before. Surprised but calmer, he simply said, "Good evening." Richard gave a slight nod and, without asking permission, leaned toward the bike. Examining it with quiet interest, Ethan quickly explained that he had been trying to fix it himself, that he needed the bicycle to get to school, but couldn't manage the chain. Richard, who hadn't touched anything as ordinary as a tool in years, crouched beside the boy. His movements were awkward at first, but eventually he managed to fit the chain back into place. His hands, usually reserved for luxury pens and polished contracts, were now smudged with grease. Ethan watched in silence, though his eyes held a subtle respect, as if he was beginning to see the distant businessman in a new light. Grace, standing at the doorway, witnessed the scene with a mix of surprise and caution. It was odd to see her wealthy, impeccably dressed boss kneeling on the ground to help her son, but something about the moment felt too genuine to be mistaken for formality. Inside, Lily sat at the table surrounded by crumpled sheets and worn notebooks filled with colorful drawings. When Richard stepped in, she didn't hesitate to show him her work. Small houses, some with crooked roofs, others with bright gardens, always full of smiling people. "I want to build places like this when I grow up," she said eagerly, lifting the papers toward him. Richard took one sheet, smoothing it as though it were a valuable project, and for the first time in years, he felt moved by the innocence of a dream. Beside her, Sam ran circles with his broken toy car, demanding attention, and when Richard bent down to play with him for a few minutes, he ended up laughing an unguarded, spontaneous laugh. The sound filled the small room, and Grace raised her eyes in astonishment. The housekeeper, long accustomed to seeing Richard only as a cold and distant figure, noticed the obvious shift. He wasn't there as the CEO, but as a man almost vulnerable, someone searching for something he couldn't name. For an instant, she feared she might be mistaken, afraid to believe there was sincerity in his actions. Yet she couldn't deny the different spark in his eyes when he looked at her children. Grace offered him a simple plate of food, and Richard accepted without hesitation, taking a seat at the modest table where Lily kept showing her drawings. Ethan quietly observed, and Sam insisted on telling endless stories. He listened to every word as if it were new, absorbing the family's routine like someone rediscovering a forgotten language. By the time he stood to leave, it was late. Ethan leaned the bicycle against the wall. Lily gathered her papers, and Sam yawned heavily, fighting sleep. Grace walked into the gate, still cautious, yet sensing something had changed. Richard glanced one last time into the house, and before stepping away, he murmured almost without thinking, "Thank you for having me." It wasn't something he usually said, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense. He climbed back into the car, and as the narrow street slipped away in the rearview mirror, he realized he had truly laughed for the first time in years. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he had stumbled upon a piece of life he had always been missing. Richard's visits to the little blue house began to grow more frequent, almost always in the late afternoons after meetings that no longer managed to hold his attention as they once did. At first, he told himself it was only curiosity, that he wanted to better understand this discreet employee who had always intrigued him. But soon he realized there was something more. The children's presence gave him a sense of life that his silent penthouse lacked. With every visit, he sat with Ethan to hear about his attempts to fix old toys, watched Lily proudly show new drawings, now bolder, filled with larger houses and creative details, and laughed at Sam's endless stories. Grace, still reserved, continued to observe him cautiously, unsure of what drove her boss to cross the city just to be there. Yet little by little, she could no longer hide the relief of sharing, even for a few minutes, the weight of her daily routine. On one of those visits, stepping into Margaret's room, Richard was struck by how much weaker the elderly woman had become. She looked more fragile, her breathing labored, but she still insisted on smiling as she welcomed him. "Good evening, Mr. Hale," she said softly, her voice faint as she extended her hand. Richard clasped it gently and, as he left the room, felt a restlessness he couldn't shake. The sight of that bedridden woman, sustained entirely by Grace's silent dedication, stirred memories he had long buried. He thought of his own mother, hunched over her sewing late into the night so that he would never go without as a boy. He remembered her calloused hands, the smell of fabric and thread, and the promise he had once made to himself that one day he would become rich enough that they would never again face deprivation. He had fulfilled that promise, but at the cost of forgetting the essence of the sacrifice that had shaped him. That night, back in his penthouse, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced restlessly, haunted by images playing over and over in his mind. Margaret struggling to breathe, Grace carrying the family on her own shoulders, the children living in the space between dreams and limitations. The comparison to his mother was unavoidable. He realized that Grace was doing now exactly what his mother had done decades earlier, raising her children with dignity, without complaint, without asking for help, simply pressing forward. The difference was that his mother had never had anyone to lean on, while he now had both the power and the means to change this reality standing before him. For the first time, he felt that turning away would not just be cowardice, it would be a betrayal of his mother's memory. The next day, between business appointments, Richard made a few discreet calls. He used the same network of contacts he had always relied on to secure multi-million-dollar deals, but now for something entirely different, to arrange medical care for Margaret. Within hours, he had scheduled appointments with specialists, ordered detailed tests, and ensured access to proper medication. He organized everything quietly, without drawing attention, without telling anyone. He wanted it to be a genuine gesture, not a performance. When he finally shared the news with Grace, she stood in silence for several moments, her eyes brimming with tears, unsure how to respond. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Richard, uncomfortable, replied simply, "There's no need to thank me. I'm the one who should be grateful." Grace was left confused, unable to understand where this transformation came from. For years, she had known Richard only as a distant, unreachable man, focused entirely on wealth and results. Now she saw him crossing the city to sit at her simple table, laughing with her children, and even moving resources to care for her mother. It was hard to believe there wasn't some hidden interest behind it, yet something in his gaze betrayed sincerity. He didn't have all the answers either. He didn't know why he cared so deeply. He only knew he could no longer turn his back on this family. It was as if every visit, every smile from the children, every quiet gesture from Grace drew him back to a part of himself he had long forgotten died in the days that followed as he oversaw Margaret's progress with her examinations and treatment, Richard realized that his life had changed in a way that could never be undone. It was no longer just about helping an employee or easing his own conscience. It was about reconnecting with the past that had shaped him, a past he had slowly abandoned in the pursuit of success. Each time he saw Margaret thank him with her fragile smile, each time he heard Grace murmur, "We're managing the best we can," each time he watched the children dream of their futures in spite of their hardships, he understood that he was staring into a mirror. Their story wasn't just theirs, it was also a reminder of his own. And perhaps that was why, even if he couldn't admit it, he could no longer stay away. The changes Richard had been experiencing no longer remained confined to the quiet nights in his penthouse or to his visits to Grace's little blue house. Slowly, the impact of spending time with that family began to spill into the company itself, which had always been run with an iron fist and an obsession with results. For years, he had cultivated a reputation as a relentless leader who saw numbers instead of people, who calculated every move with cold precision and allowed no deviations from the plan. Yet now, as he walked through the halls of headquarters, the faces of his employees were no longer just part of the scenery. He saw stories, families, responsibilities, and dreams that stretched far beyond the ID badges they wore. The memory of Grace's tired eyes, of Ethan struggling to fix an old bicycle just to get to school, of Margaret's quiet resilience despite her frailty, and of Lily's excitement as she spoke about becoming an architect began to blend with every decision he made in the office. It was in this frame of mind that Richard called a board meeting to present initiatives that stunned everyone present. Instead of discussing only new investments and acquisitions, he announced the creation of internal programs designed to directly support employees. Among them were scholarships for workers' children, comprehensive family health coverage, and an emergency fund to assist families in critical situations. The boardroom fell into silence, broken only by the shuffling of chairs as executives exchanged uneasy glances. Polished men in tailored suits looked at each other, incredulous, as if they had misheard what their CEO was suggesting. Some immediately protested, citing costs, the impact on quarterly profits, and potential risks to investors. Richard, however, did not flinch. He met their objections with a steady gaze and made it clear that these measures were not optional. They were an essential step in redefining the company's values. The pushback grew louder in the days that followed. Memos circulated, spreadsheets were drawn up to calculate losses, and whispers spread through the corridors, questioning their boss's sanity. But Richard did not back down. With the same resolve he had always brought to multi-million-dollar negotiations, he now defended every employee as if each one were a cornerstone of the company itself. He explained that building skyscrapers and luxury condominiums, while neglecting the people who actually raised those structures, would be inconsistent, almost a moral fraud. The more conservative executives continued to grumble, but Richard's determination left no room for retreat. He wasn't seeking applause, nor did he intend to turn it into a marketing campaign. His conviction came from something far deeper, an intimate need to correct the course of his life and his leadership. As the programs began to take shape, the atmosphere in the company shifted perceptibly. Employees who had once walked in with their heads down now moved with renewed energy, sharing stories of children who would finally have the chance to attend better schools, of family members who could access doctors and medication, of relief in situations that had once seemed impossible. The news spread quickly, and even those who weren't directly affected felt the ripple effect of hope returning to the corporate halls. Richard walked among them in silence, attentive to their reactions, sensing that this movement, though still new, was already reshaping the way people saw him. He was no longer just a distant executive in his glass tower, but someone who cared about what happened beyond the quarterly goals. Grace still working her shifts in the lower floors of the building, followed the news with a mix of surprise and disbelief. She overheard employees talking excitedly about scholarships and the new health plan, listened to heartfelt accounts from mothers who no longer had to choose between food and medical care, and understood that all of this was happening because Richard had chosen to act differently. Still, she preferred to remain on the sidelines, unwilling to assume any credit, watching from a distance as someone who had never considered herself part of the big decisions. Yet deep down, she knew the truth. These transformations hadn't been born in financial reports or high-level meetings. They had begun in her own home, at the simple table where Richard had sat with her children, in the room where Margaret smiled through her pain, in the yard where Ethan struggled with his bicycle. Richard himself never needed to say aloud where his inspiration came from. Every decision, every change carried the invisible imprint of what he had witnessed in Grace's life. He could no longer separate the two worlds. When he signed documents approving funds for scholarships, he remembered Lily showing him her drawings, as if she were already the official architect of possible dreams. When he pushed the executives to support the emergency fund, the image that came to mind was Margaret's labored breathing in a modest bed. And when he saw the first tangible results, the joy he felt didn't come from the figures in the reports, but from the sense that he was rebuilding himself from the inside out. Richard Hale was becoming a different man, and everyone, both inside and outside the company, was beginning to notice. Richard's visits to the little blue house had become part of Grace's family routine. What once felt like an unexpected appearance was now something everyone anticipated on Saturday afternoons or during weeknights, when the CEO chose to forgo meetings and high-profile engagements to cross the city and sit on the worn-out couch in that small, lively living room. Ethan, the oldest, had begun to see him almost as the father figure he had been missing since his dad's death. Whenever possible, he would pull Richard outside to the yard or the porch, showing off the bicycle he'd managed to fix, asking for tips on adjusting chains, or even seeking advice about school, as if looking for guidance from someone older and wiser. The bond grew naturally, without the rigidity of boardrooms or the pressure of executive offices. Richard listened patiently, answered when he could, and, more importantly, offered something rearer than solutions: his presence, which Ethan caught. In an early adolescence, valued more than anything money could buy. Lily, on the other hand, found in Richard an eager listener for her dreams. Each time he arrived, she would rush to show him her new drawings, now sketched with better notebooks and colored pencils he himself had given her. Page after page came to life with houses larger than before, buildings with hanging gardens, tree-lined, streets always filled with smiling figures. "One day, I'll be an architect," she would say with conviction, holding up her papers as though they were official blueprints. Richard smiled at her determination, realizing that in every colorful line there was something genuine, something that connected his own empire of steel and glass to the pure imagination of a girl envisioning a better tomorrow. He had never paid much attention to children's doodles before, but now he found himself treasuring each one, as if they were projects just as significant as his company's million-dollar contracts. Sam, the youngest, was the most spontaneous in welcoming him. Without hesitation, he would run to Richard, throw his arms around his legs, and cheerfully shout, "Uncle Richard." The title sounded unusual at first, but Richard eventually accepted it with a warm smile. To the boy, it didn't matter whether he was the powerful head of a construction empire or just a regular guest. What mattered was the attention he gave, the laughter they shared as they played with toy cars on the living room floor, the simple stories they invented together. That natural affection stripped away every layer of formality Richard was used to carrying. With Sam, he wasn't a CEO, wasn't a millionaire, wasn't a man of authority. He was simply someone who belonged in their afternoons, someone who gave and received affection without expectations. Margaret, from her bed, watched it all with tearful eyes. Each time Richard walked in, she insisted on thanking him, gripping his hand with a surprising strength for someone so frail. "I never thought I'd live to see my daughter supported like this," she would whisper with her roughened voice, her gaze full of pride as she looked at Grace. For her, it wasn't just about material help. It was the reassurance that her daughter no longer carried the burden alone. Richard always felt a knot in his throat when he heard those words, because deep down he knew they echoed the memory of his own mother. It was as if, by standing beside Grace's family, he was not only helping them but also honoring the promise he had once made, to never turn his back on those who carried the weight of the world with quiet strength. In that modest home, Richard discovered something no dinner with wealthy businessmen had ever offered him: the feeling of belonging. The children treated him with natural ease, without titles, without flattery, simply as someone who was part of their daily life. He realized it in moments when Lily called, "Uncle Richard, come see my new drawing," or when Ethan asked his opinion on something as ordinary as fixing a flat tire. Grace's home didn't welcome him with formality, but with spontaneity, as if he were expected, as if he were one of them. What once felt foreign slowly turned into comfort. The sound of children's voices, the small toys scattered across the floor, even the smell of simple food cooking in the kitchen became memories he carried with him when he returned to the silence of his apartment. And amid it all, Grace watched him. There was still caution in her eyes, as if she were trying to understand how far his interest would go. But each day, she felt Richard shedding the image of the distant boss. He was no longer the man who once walked the company halls ignoring everyone around him. Sitting in her small living room, laughing with Sam, treasuring Lily's drawings, or listening to Ethan's questions, he seemed like someone entirely different. And that change wasn't just about isolated gestures. It was something deeper, almost visceral, that was transforming not only the millionaire, but also the way he was beginning to see himself in the world. For the first time in decades, Richard felt that he had found a place where he truly belonged, a home that, though not tied to him by blood, had already embraced him as part of the family. Richard Hale was no longer the same man who, months earlier, had walked with a hardened stride through the company's corridors, closed off from the world and surrounded only by figures and contracts. The lavish dinners that once filled his weekly schedule now seemed colorless. Endless conversations about investments and possessions that no longer sparked any sense of pride. Sitting at those banquet tables, surrounded by glittering glasses and elaborate dishes, he found himself absent, his mind wandering not to profits, but to the memory of children's voices echoing inside the little blue house. The silence of his penthouse, once something he valued as a shield for focus and distance, had become unbearable. The contrast between the hollow sophistication of his own world and the warm simplicity of Grace's life was so stark that for the first time in decades, he knew one thing with certainty. There was no going back to the man he used to be. Late afternoons and weekends had become the moments Richard looked forward to most. While other executives sought out business dinners or international trips, he found meaning in crossing the city to the modest neighborhood where the Blue House stood. On one of those weekends, Lily ran up to him with yet another drawing, created with the same boundless enthusiasm as always. The paper, worn at the edges, showed a large house surrounded by flowers, with wide windows and a garden full of color. But what caught his attention was at the very center. Inside that house, she had drawn all of them: Grace, Margaret, Ethan, Sam, Lily, and himself, smiling among them. When he saw it, Richard's eyes filled with tears he couldn't hold back. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a silent declaration of belonging. Ethan, more confident than before, came closer to explain that he wanted to help. His mother with small repairs around the house and asked Richard for advice on how to learn. Sam, as always, bounced around him joyfully, chanting, "Uncle Richard," and proudly showing off a toy car he had finally managed to put together almost entirely. Margaret, propped up in her room, watched the scene with tenderness, her gratitude so clear it needed no words. Grace stood nearby, holding a simple cup of coffee, her eyes glistening as if trying to process what was unfolding before her. For her, it was still hard to believe that the man who once seemed so unreachable could be moved by the simplicity of a child's drawing. But Richard understood with absolute clarity what it meant. He, who had spent his life erecting skyscrapers and designing developments that reshaped skylines, now realized that none of those towering constructions had ever given him the feeling he experienced as he stared at Lily's colorful sketch. The irony was undeniable. The buildings he built were worth millions, but they were made of steel and concrete, cold and distant. That child's drawing, scribbled with uneven strokes, held within it an immeasurable wealth, the kind that could never be bought. In that moment, Richard finally grasped that his greatest accomplishment wasn't in the signed deals or the glass towers he had raised, but in the lives he had learned to truly value. That night, back at his penthouse, Richard looked one last time at the glowing skyline of the city. The buildings that dominated the view, many of them his own creations, no longer filled him with the same pride. He thought about the years he had wasted chasing a kind of success that now felt empty. He remembered his mother, bent over her sewing machine to keep food on the table, and realized that at some point along his path, he had drifted far from what really mattered. Through Grace, Margaret, and the children, he had found that missing thread again. It was no longer about money, prestige, or power. It was about humanity, dignity, and the ability to connect with real people, to be present in their lives. That was the legacy he now wanted to carry forward. The following Sunday, when Lily once again showed him her drawings and Ethan asked for help with schoolwork, Richard didn't hesitate to get involved. He smiled effortlessly, laughed at Sam's silly jokes, and accepted Margaret's words of thanks as gifts greater than any contract he had ever signed. In that modest home, he had found something no amount of wealth could buy, a place where he truly belonged. And as he watched Grace setting the table, a deep certainty settled in his heart. True wealth was not in glass mansions or luxury cars. It was in the laughter of children, the gratitude of an elderly woman, and the quiet strength of a woman who held everything together with dignity. Richard Hale had finally discovered what had always been missing from his life. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.